community. You know what I mean? So I do think it is harder, although that's not to take away from the stress of step-parent families, which are always difficult. They're always very hard. It was never like the Brady Bunch. It was, you know what I mean? There's always a lot to navigate.
So I have two questions. One of them is the Indian Child Welfare Act, was that overturned through the case that you're talking about, or?
I don't think, I mean, it's similar to the way that Obergefell overturned or overturned all of the state laws. They didn't say now this law is struck for the books, but they essentially said that the three considerations that make up the Indian Child Welfare Act can be overridden if with very minimal justification. So essentially the law is toothless.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second is about surrogacy. Can you speak for a couple minutes about existing laws about surrogacy?
Okay, surrogacy is legal in almost everywhere in the world. Even in most of the countries that have legalized same-sex marriage, surrogacy is always the sticking point. So for instance, in France, right now there's an enormous controversy over surrogacy. In Spain, surrogacy is illegal. Even in the UK, surrogacy is almost effectively illegal. It's illegal in Canada. So basically, the places where people, and surrogacy, you guys know what that is. It's where either an infertile heterosexual couple or two men pay a woman to gestate their child. For a while, the top destinations, it became the source of a great deal of tourism for gay male couples. They would fly to different places where it was legal, and if they had enough money, they went to California. That was one of the major destinations. If they didn't have that much money, they would go to India. But then in 2013, India banned surrogacy for gay couples. See, one of the problems with the wave of anti-surrogacy laws is that very often it is homophobic. Do you know what I mean? Where they let heterosexual couples do it, and then they only ban it for gays, which then feeds the, you know what I mean, the LGBT community's hostility towards it. You have in Mexico, where because Cancun had become such a huge reproductive tourism center, they did eventually pass a law that foreign couples of any sexual orientation could not come to Mexico to hire surrogates, and no gay people, whether they're Mexican or not, could do it. In Europe, typically what happens is gay male couples go to another country like Thailand, although Thailand also started banning it as well, and it'll probably move to Vietnam. You know, it moves around from country to country. But typically what they would do is they would go abroad, they would bring the child, they would get the child, they would fly to Spain, and then they would try to register the child. They would try to get the child entered into Spain, and then they would try to get the child registered as a Spanish citizen. And then what would happen is it would end up in the courts, and the courts would say, surrogacy is illegal, we can't do this because then we're opening the door to this thing which we have said is illegal, and the public relations war then begins because people say, well, it's driven by homophobia, and that's how they've done it. So in a place like Israel, for instance, after the earthquake in Nepal, I don't know if you guys all saw that, there was, I believe, over 60 Israeli couples who went to get the babies that were gestating in the Nepali mothers, or that had just been born, and they left the Nepali mothers there. And then they went to Israel, and then there was all this resistance to Israel, and the public sympathies were torn in a million different directions. A lot of people were like, well, I mean, the kid didn't ask to be born into this horrible situation. I mean, we can't send the kids back to Nepal where there was an earthquake, and the mothers don't want them. You know what I mean? So the laws are a patchwork, but it is overwhelmingly illegal. And in New York State, it's illegal because in 1992, before gay people were involved in surrogacy at all, Mario Cuomo signed into law legislation that basically said this is baby selling, this is child trafficking. That's how it was defined in the books. It's treated like child slavery, and they're fighting to overturn that now, largely because of the influence of the gay. Is that? Yeah. I mean, it is a huge, 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 huge issue, and this is the one issue that got me the most blowback. You know what I mean? Because the minute that I mentioned 13th Amendment in an article, I mean, I was just blitzed by all of the gay press. But I think it's a huge question. I don't know how close we can get to buying and selling people before, at what point no longer tolerate that? You know, at what point does that become insupportable? Does that answer?
What would you say about the fact that just any couple trying to adopt someone from overseas, their child from overseas, has to pay a lot of money? Would you not want that to happen either because it's fine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way I rely on that is, I mean, adoption itself was a hugely controversial issue, especially transnational adoption, even before gay people got involved in it. And the UN passed many different resolutions against Guatemala and against Vietnam. There was a period where almost all of the adoptions internationally were coming from 3 countries, China, Russia, and Guatemala, and they had to shut them down. I think that anything that's child trafficking is a problem, especially because a lot of those orphanages we have discovered in places like Ethiopia are not actually orphanages. You know, they were orphanages in Romania, you know what I mean, in some places in Eastern Europe, but there are other countries where it was a business, and you know, the Western couples would come and they would say, look at this baby that doesn't have a home, and actually the baby had been taken from a mother. In some cases, you know, there was documentaries made about what happened in Korea, where there were mothers who dropped their children off at daycare, and then when they came back to get them, they were like, the baby's gone, and you can't do anything about it. And that was like in the 50s and 60s. So I think that we need to have very clear legislation about child trafficking. And we have to make sure, again, that when we say the best interest in the child, that we take into account everything that matters to a child, not only being fed and housed and, you know what I mean, and loved, but also some connection to their heritage, you know. And so I try in the advocacy groups that I'm part of, we have to go very, very, very carefully on that, because a lot of the people who got excited about children's rights were people who adopted children, because it was a natural thing for them. And so it's very easy to speak, you know, like the Bible says, you should speak, you know what I mean, with salt and light and gracefulness. You have to be very careful, because there's a lot of painful history behind adoption. Does that, you know, make sense? But I think ultimately, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, I think across the board we need to have a clear definition of what the best interests in the child are. When we had our last conference in Paris on divorce, one of the things that was very interesting was the French jurist who spoke to us said this was the problem in French law, was they never actually clearly defined what the best interest of the child was. And so every judge kind of decided that on their own, and it was very difficult to avoid being influenced by the parent who had more money, to get the child. Any other questions? I can send you all out in the sunlight. Yeah, thank you very much for sitting here on a Sunday, Friday, sunny Friday. The third annual conference of the ICRI, anyone can make it to England, is on November 12th in the United Kingdom, and it's going to be on the challenges faced by families of faith with sex education of children. And it's going to be very, very good, because Europe is sort of the front line for all that stuff, and we have a good lineup, and hopefully maybe if we get students interested, I might be able to get a grant, you know, to help people fly over and stuff. So keep that in mind. So, thank you.